Okay, today's daf is Kuf 100. So it's I don't know if that's a milestone. We made it to page 100. It's a big step. So we're starting 8 lines from the top of the page on Kuf. Amar Abaye says, Bor b'reshut rabim amuka asara v'rochba shimona v'zarag letocha mahatzelet hayav. So what does this mean? So we know that a pit or any structure that is 4 by 4 tefachim in its dimensions and is also 10 tefachim in its depth is considered reshutei yachid. So if you have a pit in a public domain and it has these dimensions of 10 tefachim deep and 4 by 4 wide, so certainly it should be a reshutei yachid. So if you throw a mat into it, of course it's going to be transferring from public to private. However, here we're talking about one that the width of the pit is actually 8 wide, not 4. Okay, so the first case is really not a chidush. Like Rashi says, the first case is just to open up the discussion. The second case is really the key case. Chilka b'machatzelet patur. If the machatzelet, if the mat, instead of going into the pit like this, goes in vertically like this, and it creates a division in the pit. So basically now you have 2 sections, and the mat becomes like a wall in the middle of the pit and separates it into 2 halves. Each half has less than 4 tefachim. Because now the mat has come in and has created a division. It's like a divider that fell in.
The thickness of the mat also. The thickness takes away the exact...
Yeah, the thickness is going to take away the measurement. So you're going to have slightly less than 4 tefachim on one side of the mat and slightly less than 4 tefachim on the other side of the mat. So in that case, what do we say? So patur. So Abaye says in that case you're going to be exempt because this is similar to the cases we had discussed before, where by dropping the dirt into the pit, and by dropping the dirt into the pit, you diminish the dimensions of the pit, like we said yesterday. Or when putting something down, and by putting it down, you're actually creating the domain. Okay, so this is a similar situation where in putting it down, you were actually eliminating the domain. So instead of seeing you as putting this item, putting this item into the private domain, you're actually subdividing the private domain by dropping it in, and therefore making it that there is no private domain anymore because what's left doesn't meet the requirements. So Abaye de pshitale de machatzelet mevadla machitza kol sheken chulya de mevadla machitza. So according to Abaye, and we have to remember yesterday's case was that you took some dirt from the public domain and you dropped it into the private domain. Okay, the private domain being a pit. And by dropping that dirt into the private domain, one could look at it that you just transferred a clump of dirt from public to private domain. But the only problem is that when you drop the dirt into this pit, you actually shortened the pit. You made the pit less deep, and therefore you made the pit not a reshutei yachid anymore. It's not a private domain anymore. So according to Abaye, that says that if you drop a mat into the pit, and it subdivides the pit into 2 parts that are less than the dimensions of reshutei yachid, that you're not liable. So certainly he's going to agree that if you drop dirt into the pit, you will not be liable, because in dropping the dirt, the very dropping, which would be the transfer, actually ends up eliminating the private domain from the equation because it makes it too short or too shallow to qualify. L'Rabbi Yochanan de mibayale chulya. So according to Rabbi Yochanan, who wasn't sure about the dirt case, right? He had asked the question about the dirt case. When you drop dirt into a pit, and by dropping the dirt into a pit, you minimize its dimensions to being less than 10 tefachim deep, is that considered that you transfer the dirt into a pit and now it's less than 10 tefachim deep? Or is it considered that there never was a private domain because in your transfer you shortened the pit? Okay, so that was the question of Rabbi Yochanan. So if Rabbi Yochanan had that question, so certainly according to Rabbi Yochanan, machatzelet pshita de la mevadla machitza. So he's certainly not going to think that dropping a mat in is going to qualify as eliminating the status of reshutei yachid. So both of these cases have in common that they are cases in which the transfer itself eliminates the status or eliminates the dimensions of reshutei yachid. In the first case, the dimensions are eliminated because the dirt makes it too short or too shallow. In the second case, it's because the dimensions, the width of the pit is subdivided. Right. So, but in both cases you have the same concept. Rabbi Yochanan is going to say, I'm not sure about the dirt case, but I'm sure that the mat case is not going to be considered to eliminate the status of private domain. Abaye says that in both cases you actually effectively eliminate the status of private domain by adding dirt to the pit, or by dropping this mat into the pit that's going to subdivide it into less than the dimensions needed.
Why is he sure that the mat
Won't what?
won't change the status of the pit?
Well, if Rabbi Yochanan says that even adding dirt to the pit is unclear, right? If even that is not sure about, so certainly the mat is not, because the mat doesn't even become part of the pit; it's just sitting there. That's the reason. So if Amar Abaye says bor b'shut Rabbi Mavukah asar v'rochba arba'a mele'a mayim. So let's say you have a case where this pit is 10 tefachim deep and it is 4 wide. So mele'a mayim, but it's full of water. V'zarak letocha chayav, and you threw something into it. Let's face it, this has the dimensions of a private domain. It's 10 tefachim deep. It's 4 tefachim in its width and length. So clearly, it's a private domain, and the fact that it's filled with water doesn't matter. However, mele'a perot v'zarak letocha patur. But if you filled it with vegetables or fruits, in other words, instead of filling it with water, you filled this pit with fruit, so it would be considered not a private domain anymore. So what is he really trying to define here? Abaye is trying to define the difference between when is it considered that there's stuff in the private domain, but it's a private domain, and when do we look at it as you basically eliminated the private domain because you filled it up, you refilled the pit. In other words, if you took this pit and you filled it up with dirt again, everybody would agree it's not a pit anymore. What about if you filled it with water? So Abaye says, no, it's still a pit now. It's still a pit of the requisite dimensions. It's still a private domain. What if you filled it with solid items like fruit? There he says, okay, now you filled, it's like filling it with dirt. My Tama, what's the reason? So he says, because Mayim lo mevatle mechitzta, perot mevatle mechitzta. We don't look at the water as eliminating this as a structure, but we look at filling it with fruit as eliminating it with the structure, eliminating the structure itself. Because you filled it with something solid. It's just like filling it with dirt. Yes.
Fruit cannot build a partition.
No, we're saying you filled the whole thing with fruit. You filled the whole thing with fruit. It's like it would be like the balls that you jump into in Chuck E. Cheese. You filled those balls that the kids, they go into that big thing. Yeah. So let's say you filled like the pit with those. So it's not dirt, but they're full with objects. So he says if it's solid objects, basically it's the same as filling it with dirt. If it's water, that's fluid, so it's not considered the same as filling it with dirt. And if you dropped something into that water, you would be considered putting it into a private domain, because you could still stand in there. It's just water. Okay, you could still drop something. It's just water. But a solid items, it's like you filled it with dirt. Tani nam yachi similar to land in a bright hazorek min ayam leisratya. It says if a person threw from a public domain into the sea or vice versa, he's exempt. Rabbi Shimon says, Rabbi Shimon says actually even if you throw into the ocean. Now normally the ocean is considered what we say karmelit. It's not considered a public domain. Why is it not considered a public domain? So the simple reason is because it's not lehiluch rabim. It's not a place that people walk up. Even if boats pass through there, it's not a public thoroughfare at the same level as a street, obviously. So, normally, the yam is a karmelit. What happens, though, Rabbi Shimon says, if there's, let's say, a hole in the bottom of the sea, like the song, there's a hole in the bottom of the sea, and the hole is 10 tefachim deep, 4 by 4, in dimension. It has the dimensions of a Reshut HaYachid, and you threw into there. So he says that's a Reshut HaYachid, but what do you see from there? That the fact that it's full of water, doesn't matter. Because Rabbi Shimon is saying that even though it's in the sea, it's at the bottom of the sea, but since it has the dimensions of a Reshut HaYachid, it's a Reshut HaYachid. So that kind of proves Abaye's point, which is that we just look that water isn't considered to be it doesn't interfere with the status of Reshut HaYachid.
Yes,
even though
transfer from a karmelit to Yachid is not chayv in any event.
Yeah, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about transferring from a public domain to the sea. So normally transferring from the public domain to the sea.
Oh, you're saying from the public
Right,
beach.
like the street, let's say, there's a public street, there's a highway next to the ocean, so you threw from the public domain into the sea. So the sea itself would be a Carmelit, but if it went, but let's say there's a pocket in the sea, there's a Reshut Yachid there, so then it would still be considered a Reshut Yachid even though it's full of water. And apparently, we're interpreting that Rabbi Shimon is explaining the Tanakh Kama, that even though in general, the Yam, the sea, is not considered a public domain because it's not a public thoroughfare. People don't walk through the sea, but it's considered to. But if there's something there, if there's sort of a pit there that meets the requirements of a private domain, then the fact that it's full of water does not remove that status from it. Now we come to the new Mishnah. The new Mishnah says, "Hazorek arba amot bakotel." This is actually a Mishnah that we have seen quoted numerous times already in Masekhet Shabbat, even yesterday's daf. That if somebody throws 4 amot and it lands on a wall, if you threw it and it landed at 10 tefachim above the Reshut HaRabim, then what do we say? It's like you threw it in the air, meaning you didn't do anything. If you threw it within 10 tefachim, and again a tefach is approximately 3 inches or so, okay? So then it's considered to be throwing it on the ground, okay? Because it's because it's under 10 tefachim in the public domain, and throwing it.
It's a wall, right?
Yeah. So hazorek ba'aretz arba'a amot chayav, and somebody who throws in the public domain 4 amot, which is about approximately 6 feet, is considered to be liable for transfer on Shabbat. So the fact is, if you threw it against the wall and it traveled 4 amot, if you threw it so high that it's above 10 tefachim, then it doesn't count. So that's, let's say, whatever that is, about 2.5 feet high, it's not going to count. But if you threw it under 10 tefachim, so then it is going to count as carrying. So the Gemara says, "V'halo nach," the same question that was asked already at least once, if not 2 or 3 times in Masekhet Shabbat already. How can you say that throwing the ball against the wall, or throwing whatever you're throwing against the wall, is considered transfer? You bounced it against the wall. It didn't come to rest. We know that it has to come to rest. If you threw it exactly 4 amot and it bounces against the wall and comes back, you didn't do anything. Because it never stopped. It bounced back. So what does Rabbi Yochanan say? We know the famous answer already. Amar Rabbi Yochanan bidvela shemina shanino. As we've seen several times, it's talking about an object that will stick to the wall. So you threw it 4 amot and it sticks to the wall. If it sticks to the wall at a point which is above 10 tefachim, you didn't do anything. If it's below 10 tefachim, you're liable. So even though it's not touching the ground, the point is that it's stuck. It's an oily date. Okay, a fat date. So it sticks to it's going to stick to the wall and it's not going to bounce back. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Rav Chia, Amar Rav, Amar Rabbi Chia. So Rabbi Yehuda said that Rav said that Rabbi Chia said, "Zarak le'mala me'asarav v'halcha v'nacha bachur kol shehu banu lemachloket Rabbi Meir v'Rabbanan leRabbi Meir da'amar chokikin lashlim mechayev leRabbanan da'amar in chokikin lashlim lo mechayev." We also learned this earlier in the Masechet in the first parak as well, which is if a person throws an item and it lands in a hole in the wall. Okay, so there's a wall in the public domain. This wall is actually 10 tefachim high, and this wall is actually 4 tefachim thick. But it landed in a small, tiny hole in the side of the wall. So what do we consider it? Did it go into a private domain? It entered into this wall. So we have a machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, which is a question that is called chokekin lashlim. Chokekin lashlim means if you have a structure that you could carve a shape out of, do we consider it as if it's carved out? So really, what would you need in order for this hole to qualify as a private domain? It would have to be 4 by 4 tefachim, as well as being 10 tefachim high. Now it's already 10 tefachim high, but it's not fully 4 by 4 tefachim because it's a little hole. That you could carve out a space of 4. The wall is thick enough that you could actually carve out a piece of 4 by 4 tefachim. But right now, it's just a little hole in a potentially carved out wall, but it isn't carved out. So what is the original basis of the machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim is a case of mezuzah, where at the bottom of the doorway, let's say you have an arched doorway, at the bottom of the doorway you had enough of a space that was wide enough that required a mezuzah. But this doorway arches slowly, so that before it reaches the requisite height, it's already curved around and become too narrow to qualify for mezuzah. So do we say, well, since if we cut into the wall, we could make a square doorway that would meet the requirements, we look at it as if it is done. Since it's partially cut, and at the bottom it has the requisite measurement, so we imagine as if we could cut out the entire thing, and therefore you put a mezuzah. Or do we say, no, since before it reaches the requisite height, the actuality is that it's curved around to less than the requisite width, so therefore we say, we don't imagine what it could be, we look at what it is. So that's what chokekin lashlim means. Do we imagine? So Rabbi Meir says we imagine it, chokekin lashlim. We imagine what it could be, and we treat it like what it could be. The Chachamim said we only look at what it is. So here too, according to the Rabbi Meir, we would say that that this hole is in a wall where it could have been cut out 4x4. So since it could have been, we treat it like it is. The Chachamim say no. Right now, all it is a little hole in the wall. So since it's just a little hole in the wall right now, we don't treat it like anything more than that. And in fact, we have proof that they argue about this case as well, because it says, Tani Nami Hachi, it says in a Baraita, Zarak lemala me'asar v'halacha v'nacha b'chor kol shehu Rabbi Meir mechayev v'chachamim potrin. Exactly what we just said, Rabbi Meir, in this exact case. We're making an analogy to this case from the case of mezuzah, but actually in a Baraita it explicitly says that if you threw something and it landed in a tiny hole in the wall, according to Rabbi Meir, the fact that it landed in a hole in the wall, we look at it what the wall's dimensions are, not just what the hole's dimensions are, and we envision what we could do with that hole. We could expand the hole to be the requisite measurement. But according to the Chachamim, we don't do that. We just say, listen, it landed in a tiny hole. That's all it is a tiny hole. And it doesn't count as a Reshut HaYachid. So that's where we are. Did you have something?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
What was the problem?
Well, the question is really about the wall itself.
Right.
10 fucking high, this is a private domain.
Right.
Is it just
the wall
itself is
on top of the wall, right? Like if the wall is 4x4
right.
and it were to land on top of that,
right.
So then you would say, okay, it's in a private domain for sure. The surface on top, but now we're talking about a little hole in the side of the wall.
Right.
So and it's above 10 tefachim. So what's the problem? Since it's above 10 tefachim, you might call it makom petur. You would call it an exempt area because that side of the wall is actually facing the Reshut HaRabim. It's facing the public domain. And normally in the public domain, anything above 10 tefachim is nothing. Right. So this is sort of so do we consider it do we look at it as inside the wall, as if the wall, it's like entered that Reshut HaYachidness of the wall? Or do we look at it as just hanging over the public domain in a little crevice in the wall, but it hasn't really fully penetrated the wall, right? It doesn't really have its own place.
But
that's the question. The wall itself qualifies.
The whole wall.
Right.
If the whole wall qualifies, then why the issue? Why the problem?
Only because it's facing the Reshut HaRabim. That's why. So since it's facing the Reshut HaRabim and there's just a little hole in the wall, so it's not on the main surface of the wall. The main surface of the wall would be the top. So if you were on the top where it actually has the dimensions, in other words, of 4x4, it's actually resting on a place that has the dimensions of 4x4, then for sure. But here you're dealing with just a little tiny hole in the wall that doesn't itself have the dimensions of the Reshut HaYachid. That's the problem. So that's why it makes it complicated here. So now the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda says, the Rav says, Tela mitlaket, similar case, where we have this sort of quasi Reshut HaYachid. Tela mitlaket means it's a hill that progressively becomes steeper. So at the top of the mountain, when you're at the top of the hill, you are 10 tefachim above the ground, then it's 4x4 tefachim. But what about but what about the, it goes in a progression. Okay, walking up the hill, there's a slope up the hill. So how do we treat this kind of an entity? So he says that the halacha is like this, that asarab mitoch arba v'zarak v'nachal gabav chayav, that if within the first 4 tefachim you find that it is let's just read the Rashi because he explains it. So let's say what Rashi says. If you look at Tela Mitlakit in Rashi, so he says it's something which is on an angle. Right, it's midron ve'olech, so it's going in on an angle. Umitlaket me'at me'at. So at every point you're higher up. Ad shemagbia Yud mitoch dalet amot. Okay, so it's talking here about if within 4 amot, I said tefachim before, but I meant amot. If it's within dalet amot, because by the way, whenever it says arba'ah, tefachim is zachar, amot is nekeva. So let's take it out. So if within 4 amot, it's already reached 10 tefachim in height, harehu ki'ilu zakuf kulo, we look at it as a wall. In other words, the question is, how steep does that side of the hill have to be? There's a mound of dirt in the middle of you're in the dump, I don't know, there's a mound of dirt. You're in New Jersey. There's a mound of dirt in the middle of the road, and it has an incline. So the question is, if within 4 amot it reaches the height of 10 tefachim, that's so steep that within such a short, in other words, that would be like within 6 feet, it reaches the height of, let's say, 2.5 feet. Okay, so if that level of incline is there, we look at it as a wall. We look at the side of the hill as having a wall. So if that's the case, it's going to be a Reshut HaYachid on top. Harehu ki'ilu zakuf kulo. V'avei Reshut HaYachid b'mkom govho. Dim zarag Reshut HaRabim v'nachal gabav. Chayav. Okay, so that's what but Rashi says. However, v'davka nakat mitoch dalet amot. Only if the incline reaches 10 tefachim within the first 4 amot. However, de'i mitoche, if it takes 5 amot to get to that level, we're going to say that that's something that people will walk over even in the Reshut HaRabim. It's not such a steep incline. Like imagine, I'll give you an example. Like where my development, where we have the pool. If you ever look when you walk on the sidewalk, they have that incline there, like down to the pool, that you can't walk down there. Where the grass is, you couldn't walk down there. It's very, very steep. So that actually is a case where it's so steep that it's like a wall. Yeah, because it's like vertical, or it's practically vertical. So it's curved. I mean, you probably could walk, but it would be so difficult to walk because the incline is so steep. It like makes a wall there. Okay, so that's an example of where you could have such a steep incline that it'll be considered a wall. And the measurement is, if within 4 amot it reaches the height of 10 tefachim, so we're going to say that level of steepness means a wall. Anything less than that is something that somebody could walk over. Okay, so now we say as follows. Similarly, in a Braita, mavoy sheshaveh letocho v'nasa midron l'reshut harabim, o shaveh l'reshut harabim v'nasa midron letocho, oto mavoy eno tzarich lo lechi v'lo kora. Now we remember a mavoy. A mavoy is a place that courtyards would spill over into. So what you would have was houses shared a courtyard. Different houses shared a courtyard. Courtyards shared a mavoy. A mavoy is sort of the passageway between the various courtyards and the public domain. So it borders directly on the public domain. So if you left your house in the morning, you would walk through your courtyard to your mavoy. You would walk out of your mavoy into the Reshut HaRabim, into the public domain. Now this mavoy faces the Reshut HaRabim, and it has walls on only 3 sides. It has a wall in the back, it has walls on the side, and it's open to the public domain. So you were allowed to carry in a mavoy, but you had to put some kind of a symbolic item at the end of the mavoy to remind people not to carry from the mavoy into the public domain. So what they would put was either a lechi, which is a board that stands vertically, or a korah, which is a board that goes across the top horizontally. Okay, now what it says is, if the Reshut HaRabim is on a diagonal, is on an angle, in other words, there's a steep incline between the Reshut HaRabim and the mavoy, either that you have to go on a steep incline to get to the Reshut HaRabim, so basically the mavoy is higher than the Reshut HaRabim, or when you get to the mavoy, there's a steep incline down to the mavoy. Either way, so in one way or another, there's an incline. Either the Reshut HaRabim is lower and you go up, or the Reshut HaRabim is here and you go down. Whatever it might be, they are. You have a situation where there's an incline involved, so you don't need the lechi or the korah. You're not going to need any symbolic thing at the door of the mavoy. Why not? Because you have an actual wall. Because you have that incline, it's an actual wall. Why would you need a special rabbinic device to remind you when you have an actual incline if it meets these qualifications? And again, what do we say the qualifications are? Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel omer, telam et laket, asara mitoch harba, v'zak menachal gabav chayav. That what's the connection between Rabbi Chanina ben Gamliel repeats what we just said, that if a hill has a steep incline, that within 4 amot it reaches the height of 10 tefachim, it's considered to be like a wall. That's exactly the same concept here, that if there's an incline between the public domain and the mavoy, one way or another. Either it's down to the mavoi from where the Reshut Harabim is, or it's up from the Reshut Harabim to where the mavoi is. It doesn't matter. Either way, there's a wall. Effectively, there's a wall, assuming that the incline is with that 10 tfachim within 4 amot. Okay, within 6 feet approximately. New Mishnah says, Zarak, this is the most Mishnah we ever did in a day. It's short pieces here. Zarak, the reason why is because most of the ideas here have already been fleshed out. Most of them have really already been fleshed out in earlier sugyot that we've done. A lot of this is even repetition on yesterday's daf and today's. Some repetition is here, but this is the original Mishnah that it was based on. So Zarak letoch dalid amot v'nit gelgel chutz dalid amot. If a person threw 4 amot in the public domain and it rolled outside of 4 amot, or so there, patur. So there, he threw it. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Zarak letoch daled amot. He threw it within 4 amot, meaning his aim was for less than 4 amot. V'nit galgel chutz daled amot, but it was pushed. It rolled outside. So patur is exempt. Chutz daled amot v'nit galgel letoch daled amot chayav. However, if he threw it outside of daled amot, outside of the 4 amot, and it rolled back in, okay, he's chayav. Why? Because he threw it and it went outside the 4 amot. It doesn't matter that it rolled back in afterwards. But why do I care that it rolled back in? You understand? In other words, it went where it went. So that's it. So the Gemara says, "V'halo nach." But what about the problem that it never rested? Okay. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says, "V'ushenach al gabe mashu." It had to have come to rest at least momentarily on some small thing. Yes, it rolled back in, but it had to come to rest at some point somewhere. Tani Nami Achi similarly learned in a bright zarak chutz daled amot udchafatu aruach v'chnisatu. So let's say a person threw and he was a good thrower, so he threw and it traveled the distance of 6 amot, but the wind came and pushed it back. Even though the wind comes and then there's a hurricane going on, okay? So he throws a ball, the wind blows it within 4 amot. So his original action did not reach its goal because the wind blew it back, but then the wind carried it out again. So in the end, the wind actually carries it beyond the 4 amot. So what do we say in that case? So he says, "V'afal pi shechazra v'hotziatu patur." Okay, so even though he takes it back out, he's exempt because his original throw didn't reach its goal because the wind blew it back. But even though the wind then carries it, in other words, there's some motion of wind that pulls it back in within the 4 amot and then out, it doesn't matter because his original action was canceled. However, if the wind held it in place in midair for a moment, so it actually rested at a certain point, and only then, so if he threw the ball and it reached 4 amot, and the wind held it there and then threw it back, okay, this wind is a very strong wind, so then what happens then? Even though it returns, chayav. Okay, so the point is that since it paused in place at a certain point, that throw is considered to be a throw that reached its objective, even though the wind pushed it back. It's only when it never reached its objective, it never rested in its destination at all, that we're going to say that that the action didn't reach its objective. But if it rested even momentarily in its place, then it did reach its objective. Amar Rava said, Rava says, according to the rabbis, even if an object reaches 3 tefachim from the ground, it still has to physically rest on something to be considered coming to rest. Okay, and Rashi explains here that there's a machloket we learned already between the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva, that if a person throws from one private domain to another private domain with a public domain in the middle, we say that there's a machloket about kiluta kemishihuncha. Do we say that since it passed through the public domain, it's like it came to rest in the public domain? And we said there that the rabbis, that you might think that if it reaches within 3 tefachim of the ground, even the rabbis will agree that effectively is resting on the ground. But the answer is no. That even if it's within 3 tefachim of the ground, if it has not actually rested somehow, become stationary somehow at some point, then the fact that it was within 3 tefachim of the ground doesn't make any difference at all. Okay, and he gives another example where this would be practical, which is somebody throws a ball And the halacha is that in order to be chayav chatat, in order to be liable for violating Shabbat, you have to have been your mistake. You have to have done it by accident, obviously. If you did it by accident, you violated Shabbat. So you have to bring a korban chatat. But that's only if your mistake lasted the entire time. If you realized in the middle, it's no longer considered that you made a complete mistake. We're going to learn this in the upcoming dapim. So let's say a person throws a ball and forgot it was Shabbat, and mid-air he realizes it was Shabbat. So he's not going to be liable because he realized his mistake before the action reached its objective.
The pull is already done.
I know, but it didn't reach its objective yet. It wasn't complete yet. So now...
Shabbat, he was aiming for 4 amot, but it went 6 amot.
Right.
Then he's chayav.
Well, if he threw it, let's say, he threw it to just to make it simpler without bringing in the complication, he threw it to a place he's not allowed to. Okay, but then he realized before it reached there that he made a mistake. So since it didn't reach its objective yet, he still has the ability to say, oh, whoops, I made a mistake. Now, you might think that when it reaches 3 tefachim of the ground, that's already considered on the ground. So Rava is saying, no, it has to stop. Until it stops, it's still open. It's still an open issue. So now what it says is like this, that Yativ Mareimar v'kamar lalahashimata. Mareimar was sitting around and he said over this teaching of Rava, Amar li Ravina, Ravina said to Mareimar, he says, Lav hainu matnitin. Isn't this the same? What chidush are you giving me here? That it's not considered to be significant. Just the fact that it comes within 3 tefachim is not considered significant. That's right in our Mishnah. Am Rabbi Yochanan v'ushenach al gabe mashu. Rabbi Yochanan already told us that something has to come to rest in order for it to be considered to reach its objective. We said that already. Right? That was the idea of throwing it and it rolls back, or throwing it and the wind pushes it back. Right? We said it has to come to rest. So what is the chidush of Rava here? Amar le mitgalgel ka'amrat. You're talking about rolling. In other words, that the wind pushes it. Rolling is a different story. Why? Because mitgalgel and sofo lanuach. Because that thing was always in transit, and since it was windy, it wasn't going to eventually land in its destination to begin with, because it was windy. Here, but here you might say it's a straight line. In other words, there's a difference between a situation where there's a hurricane going on and you're subject to the wind, and therefore we don't have any proof that your object has reached its destination until it actually hits the ground because the wind is blowing it. So unless it actually bounces and hits the ground, we're not going to consider it to have come to rest. Whereas, because the wind is blowing and pushing it. Whereas over here, Rava is talking about a case where even though it's a simple straight line between 2 points, the ball is going to land. We know it's going to land. And still, you're not liable until it actually rests on something. That is a chidush of Rava. So the case of the wind is a different story. There you might have thought we need proof that it's going to land because the wind is raging and the wind is blowing it. And therefore it has to remain in place and stationary or whatever, at least for a moment, to count. Maybe you would say that's not true about a regular throwing case, because maybe you would say that within 3 tefachim we already consider it to have landed. The answer is we don't consider it to have landed. Now the new Mishnah says, Hazorek bayam.
If I can stop the malacha.
Right.
Say I put dough in the tanur and just a second later, it's Shabbat. I can stop it.
That's a big question. That's a question.
And it's better to stop it or just leave it there. Since I don't need to chatat.
That's exactly the question that came up in the beginning of the Masekhet. Whether you
they're slightly different. They're talking about Isser D'Rabbanan
to remove it.
To remove it. Here I'm talking about myself, where
you yourself wanted to do it. You yourself wanted to remove it.
Which is better? The question is for me.
Right. So that was what the Gemara talked about there. The Gemara talked about there that if you remove the bread, so since now you're doing it, in other words, you put it in by accident. Since now it's not really going to be a liability for you anyway because you realized it, there's no reason for you to take it out because you're doing another Averah by removing the bread. That you don't need to because you're already not liable. That was what the Gemara had said. So then it said, well, what about your friend doing it and all that? What about when it's b'mezid and your friend wants to save you and all that? That was the case much earlier in the Masechet. So now the new Mishnah says, bayam arba amot patur. Throws in the ocean 4 amot. He's exempt. Why is he exempt? Because the yam is a karmelit. Okay, it's a karmelit because it doesn't lend itself to easy passage by the public. But let's say there's a huge puddle, large one, Okay, we're not talking about a little puddle that people pass through. If you threw into that puddle and you threw 4 amot and it landed in that puddle, you're still liable because it's considered part of the Reshut HaRabim because people walk through it. Since people walk through it, it's part of the Reshut HaRabim. What is the dimension that it's still considered a puddle of water? It has to be less than 10 tefachim. Okay, if it's less than 10 tefachim, then it's still considered a part of the Reshut HaRabim.
Deep.
Right, deep. If it's more than 10 tefachim deep, 10 tefachim or more, it's not considered a Reshut HaYachid still, but it's considered to be, well, not necessarily, I should say, but it would be considered to be a Carmelit now. It's going to be considered a place which doesn't lend itself to passage by the public domain. So by the public. So then the Mishnah says which seems to be is a word for word repetition of the middle of the Mishnah, because it says a puddle in the public domain and people walk through it. Somebody who throws 4 amot into it, chayav. So why does it say it again? Why does it have to tell me again that I'm liable for throwing into this place? It should be. It should be that I learned that from the first clause. So the Gemara says, Amar leha ume Rabbanan the Rava. One of the rabbis said to Rava, Bishlama hiluch hiluch trei zimnei akamash malan hiluch alidei adachak shema hiluch tashmish alidei adachak la shemei tashmish. We learned earlier that the reason for the repetition here, why does it mention that a puddle through which the public domain travels, or the public travels, is considered part of the public domain? Why does it mention it twice? To emphasize to you that a place that the public travels through is considered part of the public domain. But even though it's not comfortable to travel through it, like it's not pleasant to travel through the puddle, but people will do it if they have to. That's different than tashmish al yedei adachak. That means something that can only be used with difficulty is not considered use. So, for example, the example that the Gemara gave back in the first perek was a hole in the public domain that's only 9 tefachim deep. So why don't we say that it's really an extension of the public domain? Because if you had a pillar that was 9 tefachim high, we would say it's part of the public domain because people will rest on it, or they'll rest their baggage on it. Why don't we say that a hole in the public domain that's 9 tefachim deep is considered to be part of the public domain as well? So the Gemara had said the reason is because it's not comfortable for people to use it. So passage that's not comfortable, we still consider passage, that people will walk through it. But usage that's uncomfortable, we don't consider it to be usage. So now but why does it have to mention puddle twice? Why can't it give us 2 examples instead of mentioning the puddle 2 times? One is talking about summertime, one is talking about wintertime. You need both. You might have thought if we only mentioned summertime that the puddle is considered part of the public domain during the summer because people pass through it. They like to cool off by passing through the wet place. However, but during the winter time when it's rainy season, nobody's going to want to walk through the puddle. And if we only knew that during the winter time it was considered part of the public domain, maybe that's the kevan de mitanfe lo ichpat, because since you're dirty anyway, you might as well walk through the dirty puddle too. It's rainy season anyway. But you might have thought that the summertime people want to stay clean, so they're not going to walk through the puddle. So therefore we need both cases of a puddle, that whether it's summertime or wintertime, whether it's rainy season or dry season, we consider the puddle in the public domain to be part of the public domain. Even though it's not the most comfortable way to go, people will pass through it as long as it isn't 10 tefachim in depth. Okay, now obviously the reason why it's a Carmelit and not a Reshut HaYachid, by the way, that I mentioned before, is because it's not 4x4 tefachim, this puddle, apparently. So if it were 4x4 tefachim and 10 tefachim deep, it would be the same as a pit in the public domain that was filled with water, which we said before is a Reshut HaYachid. So Abaye says, why do you need 2 cases? Not because of winter and summer. It's darich. You need it for a different reason. Salka datach amina, because you might have thought as follows: Hanimi lehecha dela have dalid amot. So you need it to emphasize that the width of this puddle doesn't matter. That even if it's 4 amot across, and again, it would have to be narrow enough that it's not 4 by 4 tefachim, because in that case, then you would have a different issue of it being a reshut yachid. But even though it's 4 amot wide, you might say, well, people are going to go around it if it's 4 amot wide. Nobody's going to wade into a pool that's for 4 amot. For 6 feet, they're going to walk through a pool in the middle of the Reshut HaRabim. So the answer is no. Even as long as it's not 10 tefachim deep, people will still go through it. Rav Ashi Amar Rav Ashi says, it's tarich. There's another reason why we have to mention the puddle twice. Salka datach amina hanemi lehechad dahavadalet. I'll say the opposite. You might have thought that if it's too narrow, it's not part of the public domain. Why not? Because people will jump over it. So maybe something that you throw into that puddle won't be considered to be resting in the public domain, because that itself is not part of the public domain, because people will jump over it if it's narrow. So the opinion immediately before, Abaye was saying, what would you think? You'd think if it's too wide, people will go around it, so it's not part of the public domain. Rav Ashi is saying, you might think if it's too narrow, it's not part of the public domain, because people will jump over it. Right? Va'azda Rav Ashi l'tameh. And he's following his own opinion. Damar Rav Ashi, because Rav Ashi said, "Hayman dizarik v'nach agodad digamla mechayev shari rabim bokinpo." That if there is a bridge that has a board, one board that's kind of detached from the other ones, so most people will jump over that board. They're not going to want to step on that board. But many people will walk over the board because it's still resting on the bridge. So he said that even though many people will jump over it, it's still considered that if you dropped something on that board, you transferred it in the public domain. The bridge was wide enough to be it was considered a public domain, the bridge. So if it landed on that board, even though that's a board that many people skip over because it's a loose board, still it's considered part of the public domain. So too here, even though this puddle is narrow enough, it's thin enough that many people will jump over it, it's still considered part of the public domain. The next Mishnah says, "Hazorek min hayam layabasha, u'min hayabasha layam." In all of these cases, you're exempt. If you throw from the ocean to the dry land, from the dry land to the ocean, from the ocean to the boat, from the boat to the ocean, from one boat to another, you're exempt. Okay, the reason being here is that in all of these cases, now notice it doesn't say if you throw from the boat to the land, you'd be exempt, because you're not. The boat is a private domain. The yam is a karmelit. It's neither private nor public. And the yabasha, the land over there, the seashore is considered to be a public domain. So what you have is 3 things here. You have a public domain and a private domain, and you have the karmelit. You have the ocean, which is a karmelit. So in and out of the boat, from between the boat and the ocean, it's from a karmelit to a private domain, so you're not going to be liable. If it's from the ocean to the dry land, also it's from a karmelit to a public domain, so also not liable. From one boat to the other, it's from a private domain to a private domain, so that's not going to be an issue either. However, from the private domain to the public, from the boat directly to the land, is going to be a problem. That's why it doesn't mention that. If you have 2 boats that are tied to one another, you can carry from one to the other. That if they're not tied together, even though they might be next to each other right now, and it might be such that that there's no space between them at this moment, still you can't carry from one to the other because of that karmelit in between them, because that ocean would be in between them, and they're going to spread apart, and you're going to carry through the karmelit to the other boat. That's the concern. We're going to see more about that in the upcoming daf. But now the Gemara says, Itmar Sefina. So we said regarding a boat, Rav Huna Amar, Rav Huna says, Motzi'in Heimena Ziz Kol Shehu, O Mimale. So the question is, how do you get water onto your boat? You're on your boat, and you want to take water from the ocean into your boat, or not the ocean, let's say whatever it is. Let's say it's not salt water. Okay, but you want to take water into the boat. So what do? You can't carry from the yam into the boat, because we just said that the ocean is a karmelit. You're not supposed to take from a karmelit into a private domain. So how can you do it? So they said you extend a ziz kol shehu, you extend a board out from the boat, symbolically basically, and you just fill water. It's no problem. Rav Chizda Rabba bar Rav Huna Amrei, Rav Chizda Rabba bar Rav Huna say, Osem makom arba'a umimale. You have to create a reshut hayachid over the ocean. In other words, you lower a structure basically that would be 4 by 4 tefachim, walled over the area of the ocean where you want to be able to draw water, and you draw the water like that. But if without some kind of structure creating a Reshut HaYachid, creating a private domain around this section of the ocean, you can't take from the ocean into the boat. Rav Huna says, so how can they say that you don't need any, how can they allow you, how can Rav Huna allow you to bring from the yam into the boat? How's that possible? Kasavar karmelit me'ar'a mashchinan va'avira mekom peturo ubedinu disease nami lo liba'e elaki echid leheve lehekera. He says, you know why? Because it's true that the ocean is a karmelit, but do you know where a karmelit is measured from? From the bottom of the ocean. So by the time you're on the surface of the ocean, you're way more than 10 tefachim above the bottom of the ocean. So only if you were at the bottom of the ocean, the first 10 tefachim, where those creatures exist that we can't even see because it's so deep, that's where you would have a karmelit. But anything above that is the airspace above a karmelit. And what did we learn? We learned that just like a Reshut HaRabim, the airspace above 10 tefachim is not part of it. The airspace above a karmelit is also not part of it. So above 10 tefachim, no problem. So they're going to say that the surface of the sea or the ocean is itself not really a karmelit, because the karmelit was only the first 10 tefachim from the bottom of the ocean up. So you're taking from a mekom petur. You're actually taking from an exempt area to a private domain, and that's fine. Just like we said about the threshold. Remember, the threshold was too small, so it wasn't a karmelit, and it wasn't a Reshut HaRabim, and it wasn't a Reshut HaYachid, and it wasn't anything. So you were allowed to move from that area into your house. So too you're allowed to move from the ocean surface into the boat. And why do you need this ziz kol shehu? Then why do you even need to extend a board over the place where you are bringing the water in? He says that's just to remind you not to do it in other circumstances, to remind you that it's a unique circumstance. Just a reminder. Rav Chisda Rabba Rav Huna Amrei, but Rav Chisda and Rabba Rav Huna say, Oseh makom arba'a umimale. They say you have to create a real Reshut HaYachid. You cannot take water from the ocean and bring it into the boat. So what do they say? Kasavrei karmelit misifat maya mashchinan maya ar'a samichta. So they say that no, karmelit is not measured. The 10 tefachim is not measured from the bottom of the ocean. It's measured from the surface of the water. Because we look at the entire ocean as ar'a samichta, as earth. Just like we don't say, oh, I'm outside and I'm actually 10 tefachim over the public domain, because the public domain goes down to the center of the earth, and that's a lot more than 10 tefachim down. So I'm really above the ground by 10 tefachim right now, because the ground goes all. We don't look at it that way. So too, they don't look at the ocean like that. If you're on the surface of the ocean, they don't say you're above the karmelit. The ocean itself is considered like one entity, like one solid entity, and therefore we start counting the airspace of the karmelit from the surface of the ocean, not from the bottom of the ocean. And therefore, where you are collecting water is in the karmelit, and you can't bring from a karmelit into a private domain. And therefore, if you don't make a private domain there, you don't construct one, you're really carrying from the karmelit to the Reshut HaYachid, and that's no good. That's why you have to create a private domain. Amar le Rav Nachman bar Avua. Rav Nachman said to Rabba bar Avua, Ul Rav Huna Amar Motzehem Ben Aziz Kol Shehu Umimalei. I want to understand this. According to Rav Huna, who says we count the karmelit from the bottom of the ocean, and therefore when you take water off the surface of the ocean, you're really not doing anything, because you're way more than 10 tefachim over the real karmelit. So according to him, I don't understand. Zimnin deleka asara v'kam metaltel mi karmelit l'reshut hayachid. Won't there be times where you are in water of less than a depth of 10 tefachim? In which case, you're within 10 tefachim of the bottom of the water, and therefore you're actually in a karmelit, and you're actually taking from a karmelit. So what about that? So the answer he gives him is, he says, Amar le gamrina den sefina me'alechet b'pachot me'asara. We have an assumption. In other words, literally it means we have a tradition, but it means we assume that the boat is not going to travel in a place where there's less than 10 tefachim of depth of water, because the boat will be grounded if it does that, and that will be trouble. So we avoid such shallow waters anyway. So he said back to him, what about the front of the boat? The front of the boat that's raised up could theoretically be in more shallow waters because it's raised up anyway. So maybe we should be concerned that it will go in such water. The Amar Rav Safra says Gashushe Azlekama, that you always had people who would go with special sticks in front of the boats. Okay, and they would test to make sure, right? They would test to make sure the depth of the water was consistent, and therefore, even though the front of the boat is raised up very high, right? Even though the height of the front of the boat is very high, they would still be continually checking to make sure that the depth of the water was a minimum of 10 tefachim, so it's never going to be a problem. So, Marley Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak to Rav Chia bar Avin. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to Rav Chia bar Avin, Rav Chistel Rav Bar Rafuna Damrei Osam Makom Arba'au Mimalei Shofachin Didei Hechi Shadelo. I have a different question. You're telling me that according to Rabba and Rav Huna, Rabba bar Rav Huna and Rav Chizda, that the ocean is considered a Carmelit. So therefore you need to create a private domain around a section of the water in order to take water from it into the boat. But where did they pour the wastewater then? Where did they pour wastewater? They can't pour out of the boat either then. So what are they going to do then? So you can't pour it into the same place that you're taking your clean water from. Nobody will want to take clean water from a place that you just dumped the dirty water. So that can't be. So the answer is the shadelahu adafna desfina. You pour it over the side of the boat and allow it to go down the side of the boat. We're not talking about excrement, by the way. They're talking about like for cleaning dishes and stuff like that, Rashi says. They're talking about, when they would need to clean dishes, they would pour the dirty dishwater over the side of the boat and it would trickle down into the water. So then the Gemara asks, V'ha'ika kocho, what about the fact that, true, you didn't carry the water from one place to another, but you're spilling it, it's coming from you. You're pouring it down the side of the boat into the Carmelit. How can you do that if you're considering the ocean a Carmelit? So kocho b'Carmelit lo gazru. The rabbis did not prohibit kocho, indirect action. In other words, if you spill it, you poured it onto the side of the boat and it trickles down, the trickling down is not your problem. In a Carmelit, in a rabbinic domain. Where do we get this from? Sefina in mitaltelin lo mitochalayam lo minayam litocha. We said in a Braita you cannot carry from the boat into the water, nor from the water into the boat. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda says amuka asara v'en gavoa asara mitaltelin mitochalayam. He said if the inside of the boat is 10 tefachim in depth, in other words, it's a private domain, but it's not 10 tefachim above the water, so then mitaltelin mitochalayam aval lo minayam letocha. But then you can spill, you can put from the boat into the water, but not from the water into the boat. So ma'ishena minayam letocha dila deka mitaltelin mikarmelit l'reshut hayachid. So why can't you bring from the water into the boat? The reason is because you're going from a karmelit to a reshut hayachid. Mitochalayam nami. So why can you take from the boat into the water? In other words, there's a big problem here because if Rabbi Yehuda is saying that the water is a Carmelit and the boat is a private domain, so how can it make a difference if I'm going from the water to the boat or from the boat to the water? It's the same thing. So what must you say? El alav achuda. Rather, we must say that what does he mean when he says you can transfer from the boat into the water? It wouldn't make any sense to say you could actually carry something like a bucket from the boat into the water, but not from the water into the boat, because it's exactly the same thing. So what must he be referring to? Spilling something over the side of the boat. You can spill it onto the side of the boat and then it will trickle down, and that is the chidush, that you're allowed to transfer something from a private domain into a Carmelit if you do it indirectly, even though it comes from your koach. It's not direct. Now, why does he mention, by the way, that the boat is less than 10 tefachim over the ground, over the water? That's not actually significant for our case so much, but it's significant because if the edge of the boat was actually more than 10 tefachim above the ground, so then it would be, above the water, so then it would be even better Because then you could actually carry from the top of the boat into the water and back, because it would be a makom petur. Because remember, even if we're counting the karmelit from the edge of the water, from the surface of the water, 10 tefachim above a karmelit is makom petur. It's an exempt area, and there's no problem with going from an exempt area into a karmelit, or from a reshut yachid to an exempt area, or anything. So since you would be carrying from a karmelit into an exempt area, that's not a problem. Not a problem at all. So therefore, he would say, in that case, that it's not an issue at all. When is it an issue? When you're within 10 tefachim of the karmelit. So really, you're going to end up carrying directly from a karmelit into a private domain, not from a karmelit into a makom petur into a private domain. Now, even though you're not supposed to carry from a public domain to a makom petur to a private domain, or vice versa, because you're getting around the rules, because you're moving something into a neutral area and then to the other destination. With the rabbinic karmelit, you're allowed to do that. So therefore, you could take from the ocean to a makom petur, to a height of 10 tefachim, and then from there to the private domain, and that wouldn't be an issue. So that's why he says, if it were 10 tefachim elevated above sea level, then you would be able to do it no problem. It's only when it's within 10 tefachim and you're operating from karmelit directly to private domain that you can't bring from the ocean into the boat, but you could spill onto the side of the boat and allow it to trickle down into the karmelit. And this is actually what the halacha is that is brought down.
Is that relevant to like flushing a toilet?